Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're joined by Matt Cronin. Matt, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. We're honored to chat with you and really dive into some topics with you. But before we do, for folks that don't know you or know your background, can you tell us a bit about where you are now and kind of how you got to where you are in your career?
Yeah, sure. So short version. So I had the good fortune of serving as a federal prosecutor for about 7 years. During that time, I focused on cybercrime, cryptocurrencies, and transnational crime, with a focus on China in particular. From there, I was asked to go to Main Justice, where I served briefly as the National Opioid Coordinator, because a lot of my work, I was in the Northern District of Ohio, so a lot of my cyber work had an opioid lens to it, because at the time it was the epicenter of the opioid crisis. And after that, I was asked to serve as the National Security and Cybercrime Coordinator at the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys. Did a lot of fun work there and not so fun work related to ransomware, SolarWinds, etc. Then I was asked to help join an amazing team to help stand up the Office of National Cyber Director at the White House.
That's awesome. Quite an extensive background, lots of different experience that I know we're going to dive into a little bit more as we chat more. But I wanted to open with, because I saw that you did something really cool recently, which was being on a Cyber Jeopardy panel, which I've never heard of. And I thought that was such a cool concept. So that was at the American Bar Association. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, because as security practitioners, it's one of those things I'm really fascinated in, is sort of where cyber and cyber law sort of meet. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the intersection of cybersecurity and law?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different ways we can go with that question. So one of them could be how, because we're a nation founded on the rule of law, that our laws inherently inform what we can and cannot do, or should not do, in relation to cybersecurity. Another, which was kind of the focus of Cyber Jeopardy panel, which was this amazing attorney Brian Hill's idea, and it went really well, was that both cybersecurity and the law as a profession use a lot of jargon and, like $10 words or a 10-cent word were due, which I think really inhibits the ability of lay people and even experts in other fields to understand the implications of cybersecurity or legal issues. And the third is kind of the sequencing or pacing of cybersecurity in relation to cyber law. So at least from my vantage point, cyber threats, like cyber offense, greatly outpaced cybersecurity for the past, say, 20 years or so. And then in the last decade, you saw a lot of fast movement in cybersecurity, realizing, oh my gosh, this actually is a big problem. And for the private sector, if you're in the cybersecurity field, it's quite profitable to deal with that problem, right? And so the markets started solving that problem for society. At the same time, though, cyber law, as is true for any sort of any area, right? The law lags between what's happening in the market. So we're now hitting an inflection point where Congress, the White House, et cetera, has fully realized this is a big issue. The public has realized, I think, it's a big issue. And we're at the point now where we're developing, whether it's executive orders like EO 14028, and then now a lot of work in Congress to address this threat and create the proper framework for cybersecurity by design.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think we're seeing a lot of tremendous intention around the executive order and obviously upcoming national cyber strategy, which we'll touch on here soon. One thing I wanted to ask you, and you and I chatted a little bit about this, is like, what are some of the challenges of, cybersecurity? And you talked about society and law, like in a society like ours, a democratic, free society versus, maybe say an authoritarian regime. What are some of the challenges of trying to implement secure, rigor and security in a society like ours?
Yeah. So, I mean, I used to game before I had kids. I don't anymore. But the way you think about it, use gaming terminology, is, creating a resilient cyber infrastructure, cybersecurity by design in a liberal democracy. That's hard mode. Any idiot could create, as long as you have the right people and tools, any idiot can create cybersecurity within an authoritarian state, because there's no rights, right? The people serve the state rather than state serving the people. There's no real rule of law protecting people's interests. So that means if China or Russia or anybody thinks it's a problem on a network, they just go onto the network. They don't need to do anything special there. If they think someone is a problem, they just put them in a work camp or eliminate them. There is no rule of law protecting that individual. That is a horrible nightmare scape. No one wants to live in that. At least I don't think so. But that means that for us to have a society that preserves our democratic values, right to free speech, to privacy, to property, while at the same time ensuring that all of society, from an individual, playing a game, or an individual driving his, an e-vehicle, right, that could otherwise be hacked and has digital components, all the way up to Fortune 500 companies and departments and agencies are secured by design. That requires a lot more work and a lot more thought, a lot more effort. It's worth it. But we're in the midst of that now, making sure we figure that out and do it right so that it's secure, not just now, but for generations to come.
Yeah, I think we're hearing a lot of that, kind of building security in this kind of catching hold, is trying to, address these systemic issues that we see now. One thing I wanted to ask you too, given your unique background of having the legal and the law background and DOJ and so on, what are some examples or, situations that you've dealt with previously, without getting into specifics, where you've had to kind of address cybersecurity issues and investigations, but also keeping in mind freedom and individual privacy, and, how are some of those challenges that you've encountered before?
Yeah, no, it's an important question to ask. So, and folks will talk to us, the Office of National Cyber Director, and again, there's amazing people there from across the government and the private sector. They'll just be like, well, why don't you just, do X, Y, Z? Why don't you just go on the network? Or why don't you just go and like, drone someone halfway around the world? Those are kind of silly concepts, right? Because in our society, it's not how we operate. We understand the rule of law, understand fundamental rights, and that's what makes our country great and other similarly aligned countries. So as a prosecutor, the first things you think through for every sort of a case, no matter how aggressive you are, is, am I ensuring the defendant's rights are safe? So if you can, under the Fourth Amendment, you can search and seize, right? You can go onto a network, but you have to do so in a way that's compatible with that fundamental constitutional right. That means you have to do your due diligence, you and the amazing agents you work with, and you put together an affidavit and you put it before an independent judicial magistrate, right? A district court judge or magistrate judge, and say, here's where the crime is. Here's how we know it. We have probable cause. And then what often folks don't realize, if you're doing that, you have to have what's called an attachment A and attachment B. Attachment A says, this is what I'm searching. Attachment B says, here's the really narrow range in which I am looking at this, whether it's a network or a device. And I'm not going beyond that. I'm not looking for any other crimes beyond that, because we're very careful what we do, because we deeply respect these constitutional rights. And so that, again, makes it more difficult. But at the end of the day, you can still get the job done. It's harder. One example of, I wasn't specifically involved in it, I had amazing colleagues at DOJ and FBI that was the Cyclops Blink operation, or about a year or so ago. If you recall, DOJ and FBI essentially removed this Cyclops Blink malware from this extremely dangerous group called Sandworm, coming out of Russia. And when they did that, they didn't just go onto a bunch of networks around the world, around the United States. They got a search warrant. And they got the search warrant. They said, here's exactly how legally we're allowed to do this. And they go on. And they went into this operation. The operation, they retrieved data from the malware, removed the malware from the devices, and then actually had an option where they blocked the malware unless the individual just really wants malware on their system. We even said, like, at the end of the day, it's their property. So I suppose if they want it back, they could do that. But that just shows the extent that we took working under the current framework. That said, this is not, I don't think this is the DOJ's public statement, but at least someone in the public could say, well, maybe there should be systems in place that allow for more streamlined and thoughtful process that would let the FBI and DOJ do that. That's not for me to decide. You can see how we're working really hard within the framework that currently exists to get to the right result while protecting our essential rights.
Yeah, I mean, I am totally fascinated by all of that, and that intersection of, how do you protect rights? How do you, still conduct, the searches and things that you need to do while sort of balancing that. And I'm curious, I'm going to shift us a little bit away from this, but still staying sort of with cyber and law, because I see that, especially as more and more organizations, right, whether that's public sector, private sector, local and state, they need to start, maturing cybersecurity programs and, their cyber law programs too. How do we work together? How do lawyers work together with security practitioners? How are we working on digital forensics? What sort of laws and regulations are we following? But I haven't seen a ton out there, any, literature or resources out there available to sort of support that. So how do you think we can sort of build both programs in combination? How do you think we can get security practitioners and lawyers to start working really well together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're right. There's not nearly enough of that right now. There are some amazing teams out there, usually a mix of a law firm and then an IR firm that go into an incident and they do incredible work and they protect the company's interests, not only in terms of the incident in the cyber realm, but also in terms of the legal realm. Like you could stop an incident. We have a lot of reporting obligations, for instance, or you could stop the incident. You don't understand from the IR side because it's not your job as a cybersecurity professional. That's great, but they're about to be sued into oblivion unless you take the following steps to make sure that you are properly remediating, you've notified the proper authorities. So it's an incredibly important work. There is some of it now. There needs to be more of it. I think what it comes down to is for both sides to understand each other's value, and that's just one of the things that I've loved coming to the Office of National Cyber Director. Is I have folks from all over departments and agencies, and also from the private sector. And you can just see that, kind of understand from their viewpoint where they're coming from in response to cybersecurity. While at the same time, give to them the viewpoint of, in my case, a federal prosecutor and attorney who says, yeah, we can do all these things. And I can learn from them. But at the same time, you have to understand kind of the legal implications that informs a lot of what we do in the future. So to kind of get directly to your question, what I'd say is, going forward, having more either joint organizations or more messages explaining how these two complementary skill sets really can work incredibly effectively, where it's not just 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 equals exponentially higher number for the client and for the public interest.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see how that collaboration would be critical to effectively, carrying out operations, investigations, and doing so legally at the same time. So I wanted to ask you another question is, every time, and I'm in cyber, I've been in cyber almost 20 years. Every time I turn on the news, for quite a while now, we're seeing cyber incidents, another breach, another incident of some sort. Are there any historic parallels for what we're experiencing on the cybersecurity front, from a national or society perspective?
Yeah, so this actually is something I stumbled on somewhat accidentally, and it sounds crazy. And I'm still working this through, but I think it's pretty good. You tell me if I'm off. So in the late 1800s, so I figured this out because I was speaking at some event in Austin on cyber law, cybersecurity, et cetera. And I walk by, and there is this statue at the Capitol in commemoration to these volunteer firefighters. And this statue discusses this huge number of people who died in this fire. And I thought, that's crazy. And then, of course, because we live in the modern age, I went out and didn't look around me in the physical world. I went onto my phone and just Googled it and looked into it. And what it turns out is that in the late 1800s, there was these things called conflagrations, where these cities, the Great Chicago Fire you've heard about, maybe the Boston Fire, where you would have, entire city blocks wiped out, sometimes miles wide, just in a night or a day, 2 or 3 days. And it would be, thousands of people would die. And in modern monetary terms, you would have, billions of dollars in losses. And this actually continued for a shockingly long period of time until it got to a point where society said, this is insane. We don't want to live in a world where at some point you wake up and, a third of the city is gone or 10% of the city is gone, or the business you've worked hard on no longer exists through really no fault of your own. Just again, a systemic risk that everyone is carrying, but it's been reduced down to the lowest common denominator, right? It's reduced down to literally a cow knocking over a gas lantern. And so in the case of apocryphally for the Chicago Fire. So what do we do? And this again goes to show that we can do the same thing here. What they did is it wasn't just one fix. It was a series of fixes across different aspects of society. So you had, when they created cities going forward, they said, you can't just have a bunch of buildings crowded together. You need to have them segmented. Network segmentation, right? If he's far enough apart that if there is a fire, it's not going to spread around easily to other buildings. You put in a system in place if you're going to make a building at the time, which is again true as in the past 30 years, 40 years for our computer digital architecture, the cities were building at a rapid rate. And so what was everyone considering as a builder? Can I build it fast and can it at least be functional? It doesn't have to be durable, doesn't have to be resilient, it just has to just exist and look pretty good and work. Who cares if something terrible happens? I'm gone by then. I'm not living in that building. And so these buildings were built, but they were highly flammable. What did they do? They said putting building codes and said, you can't do that. And if you do, there's now a legal regime. You will be sued into oblivion. You will not be able to work. You actually could be imprisoned. It's a really bad thing. And then they had properly finance and support the first responders, firefighters, give them the proper resourcing. Insurance schema came into play, saying, like, if you want to be insured, you have to have these criteria. And at the end of the day, nowadays, if you heard in the news that, you know, a third of Boston was wiped out in a fire, you would say, that's impossible. How could that possibly, that's insane. Well, our hope is that in a relatively short period of time, people will look back and say, like, the Eastern Seaboard didn't have, a huge portion didn't have gasoline for a week because some guy clicked the wrong thing. That is insane. Like, if you just take to step back from the immediacy, that is an insane outcome. As insane, I humbly submit, as a cow knocking over a gas lantern and taking out a huge portion of Chicago. So we need to understand there are historical parallels. We've done it before. It comes across society. There just has to be a public will to get it done.
Yeah, I love that story and equating it to what we're seeing in modern times, because it's funny. I was studying like criminal psychology from the 80s, and I was seeing these terms like linkage blindness and like not being able to tie things together. And I was like, oh, we see this in cybersecurity all the time, not being able to pull this information together.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of overlap there. Well, so speaking about, you know, network segmentation and, you know, we're talking about zero trust and things like that now. I want to talk about ransomware, and it's super relevant because even this morning there was came out about Dole that had the ransomware attack that you know, we're just sort of getting information about now. But ransomware has been one of those things that, you know, has been hitting healthcare hard. It's been hitting local, state and government schools. It's knocked out schools for weeks. So can you talk about maybe how cyber legislation is sort of being shaped to sort of account for ransomware, or how it may in the future?
Yeah, so ransomware is a horrific plague on our digital landscape. And as you noted, it immediately is impacting the real world as well. Schools, hospitals in particular, also other areas of critical infrastructure. So the silver lining in this terrible dark cloud is that ransomware has kind of put the issue of cyber and cybersecurity to the front of the public's attention. It's very hard for the human brain to understand that something far away can impact you and is worth your time and attention. It's even harder where the thing is not even, in many cases, in the real world, right? So you have like, oh, like North Korea hacked Sony because of a movie. That's weird. It seems like a bad thing, but okay. And people, unfortunately, the public largely just kind of moved on. But when you say like my hospital doesn't work, I could die, or my child's sick, he or she could die because of some person in Russia, you know, trying to extract, you know, 10 Bitcoins from a hospital, that is untenable. And it's kind of, at least it's captured the public's imagination, and it's shown that this is something that's worthy of fixing. And that is a terrible thing that's happening, but at least we can make the most of it and do what we can to end the scourge of ransomware. And you know, the White House, Chris Inglis, the former National Cyber Director, Kemba Walden, the current acting National Cyber Director, incredible human beings. They're doing amazing work in this space. DNSA and Neuberger, the NSC, with the Counter Ransomware Initiative, also is doing fantastic work here. We are laser focused on this issue. And it does require response, not just within the United States, not just the federal government in the United States, but also individuals, corporations, and internationally. And that's a lot of what we're doing. One final piece to add on to that is there has to be an understanding. I think ransomware is starting to get to that point, is that you cannot secure a liberal democracy, get back to the earlier point, if we're all just out on our own, out for ourselves. It simply will not work. You cannot have a system where if whether it's an APT group or a highly sophisticated ransomware group can go after each of us individually. Because if something SolarWinds and ransomware has taught us, it doesn't matter how good you are, if China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, or a ransomware group using similar techniques, they want to take you down. If you're on your own, you will go down. So that's why companies need to notify as soon as possible about the incident. Everyone gets at this point. No one thinks you're a terrible person. The shareholders understand. You're just going to get in such a worse position when you don't notify, because that plus not having the appropriate systems in place, that is how, again, based upon public reporting, that is how you get enforcement actions against you. That is how you get the equivalent of consent decrees, right? Where you can only operate your company under certain limited parameters because the public doesn't trust you anymore. The government doesn't trust you. That is how you get shareholder lawsuits. It is just not worth it individually, and it's certainly bad for society.
Yeah, you're speaking a lot of emerging and forthcoming requirements like cyber breach notification, and I would be remiss and honestly, personally a little selfish this question here. We're all waiting anxiously for the national cyber strategy. Obviously, there has been a lot of headlines and buzz about a firmer regulatory stance, for example, being emphasized in this than previous strategies of the past or previous approaches. I guess like to the extent that you can speak on it, what's your perspective on a firmer regulatory stance based on our society and the way we typically have operated around cyber?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't go into the nuts and bolts nitty gritty because it's not public yet, but I can get into certain areas that are within the public sphere already. So one of the big things we're talking about is we need to shift the burden of cybersecurity. I mentioned earlier, it's totally insane that someone clicking on something can shut down a oil and gas pipeline. That is crazy. But there's a lot of reasons for why that happened. But one of them is that we've devolved the risk down to just the random guy in a keyboard. That is a system that will never work. It is not defensible. It will never be resilient. So instead, we need to make sure that the proper people proper organizations have internalized the risk. And that in many cases are going to be larger corporations that are deriving appropriately profits for whether it's cloud computing, the servers they provide, the services they provide. They're gaining a huge amount of benefits from that through the market. It's appropriate for them to internalize those risks. That's happened many times throughout history. In fact, I'll note, these companies are on board with this, as far as I can tell, based upon their public statements and the statements they've made to OECD and elsewhere. So, if you think to automotive safety, there was a time where in the 1950s, if you drove too fast and then hit a tree, another car, you would literally be impaled on, what remained of your steering wheel. And we decided like, well, that doesn't seem very fair. We should have it so that there's safety within the automobile so that I or my children don't immediately die if I get in a car crash. And we did. There's now all these requirements: seat belts, rear facing cameras, the different airbags, etc. So all these things are now in place and we're all better for it. And back then there was a small group that would say, oh my gosh, you're going to bankrupt the automotive industry. Obviously not. Because what happened is that once people understood that safety was a factor in purchasing, you had a minimum floor of requirements, and you require transparency in what you are doing in terms of safety. People will want to buy the safer product oftentimes, right? A lot of people buy certain types of automobiles now because I think my children and I will be safer there than the other. And that matters to me. So right now, you're buying random products, whether software or hardware. There's no real way to know, is this safer? And I guarantee you, bet a paycheck, that if you have an objective, discernible way of saying this, if you buy this computer, you have a 2% risk of being hacked compared to this other guy who's 30% cheaper, but a 50% risk, the first product will sell off the shelves in 2 seconds flat, and the other ones will go out of business. We have to make sure the market properly internalizes that information and allows consumers to make informed decisions, because the market is the solution, but the market has to be informed. Another area, somewhat relatedly, with a strategy is we're realigning incentives to favor long-term investments in resiliency, right? So we're going to have security, talked about that right now, but also you want it to be resilient. You can't build a system that says, we're going to make sure that ransomware never happens again, period, end of sentence, because we have no idea what's going to happen in 5-10 years. You want a system in place that it doesn't matter what happens. You have the crazy AI hacks 10 years from now. You could have drones hovering above your house and trying to hack in through whatever, right? If you have a system that is resilient by design, you'll make sure that when these new threats emerge, we will know how to quickly contain them, deal with them, and move on. And then I guess the final big point to get into the strategy is then create this cyberspace that is, again, secure, resilient, but also reflects our values. You don't want to be in a place filled with, malware, hacks, people are afraid to use the internet, commerce slows down. You want a place where you can go on the internet and like, I'm safe, my child's safe, my business is safe. We can transact and discuss, and that's where we can thrive, as a democracy. And that's what we need to create.
Yeah, being on the Resilient Cyber podcast, you'll hear no argument from us about the need for resiliency. So I did want to ask, you touched on a lot of topics there that really, speak to me in terms of the argument or the debate around, regulatory and cybersecurity measures. Is, how do you kind of balance that market of innovation, speed to market, people leisure, and availability of innovative, technologies um, devices and things they can purchase and so on. How do you balance that dichotomy with regulating this space and implementing some of that rigor, trying to drive some of those secure by design principles in, without slowing down some of the speed to the market or things that people have gotten really accustomed to in terms of just technology basically. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. And then I also how do you do so without necessarily, like you said bankrupting the automobile industry? Like, how do we kind of drive regulatory change without, making it so burdensome on the business that, it's essentially non-profitable to be even being in the tech space, for example?
Yeah. So I think we're fortunate is that I can't speak to whether or not that may be true in other industries, but fortunately we're at the stage now where saying, should we have the market or regulations is kind of a false choice, because we don't even have like the most baseline regulations and laws in place that allows for the market to properly internalize risk and security. And I think that, going back to what I was saying a while back about just kind of removing the jargon from cybersecurity and cyber law. We talk a lot with CEOs, with CIOs, with heads of venture capital funds, with founders for startups. And one of the things that we kind of, what I try to do, right? As a prosecutor, your job is ultimately, I'm going to take a very complex issue and I'm going to hone it down so that a jury of lay people, the high school education, which is great, can fully understand it. And so when you kind of remove all the chaff away from the cyber issue, what you're eventually saying is that, listen, this is risk. You have risk. If you don't properly internalize this risk, your company could go bankrupt. Society will cease to function properly. It's a bad thing. You don't go around and just have no accounting in your company, right? That's a dumb idea. Same thing. You have to internalize these cyber risks. The problem is that, which is true for any market, any industry, if you have essentially no regulations to internalize a problem that does not immediately impact you, the market will incentivize, pushing the risk onto smaller players and ensuring that they are punished while you walk away with a profit. That's just not fair. So no matter what industry that is, I don't think anybody, no matter what political stripe you're from, says, let's do that. Let's make sure that the blue collar worker in Ohio gets completely jammed up and their company folds because we didn't make sure that cybersecurity is inherent and resilient by design. And that requires larger corporations and other organizations, including the federal government, to really get their game together.
Yeah, you actually said something that made me think of a follow-on question. And I'm no economist, but I've heard terms like least cost avoider, for example, referring to big corporations, kind of bearing the cost rather than the consumer or the end user. And you've talked about, maybe some labeling efforts. And I know NIST has some labeling efforts underway. I know in the EU there's, the Cyber Resiliency Act, which has some interesting aspects to it around, informing consumers of risk of products. How do you see that playing out in our ecosystem? Because obviously some entity, some group, whether it's a government group or a third party, has to kind of, go and validate these claims of, this label around risk or security of products. How do you see that playing out across the market, for example?
So to be clear, I'm not an economist either. I just play one on podcasts. But what I can say is, how it will work will really vary by the country, by the state, by the industry. It's worked different ways, different times historically. But at the end of the day, however we get there, I think everyone can agree, including industry, we just want to get to ground truth. We just want to understand what is happening here, what are the risks, and then making sure the appropriate actors take them. Because if you have, say, company X, which has this huge product, see, SolarWinds could be an example, right? And that was a very complex fact pattern involving a highly sophisticated Russian APT group. I'm not going to opine on, who's to blame on that. But in these situations, you can imagine at least a company similarly situated. If they really internalize risk and understood, this is something we are responsible for. We can't just be like, oh man, that's a shame that all of you got hacked around the world. Oh, well, and then just move on. If that was properly internalized, you would see a big difference. Just like if a builder builds a building and then it immediately catches on fire and kills everyone, they're like, man, that's too bad. I'm going to go build some more buildings now. Like, that's not a good outcome. Similarly, you should make sure that these companies say, yeah, like, we can't build buildings. We can't build security architecture or software or hardware that essentially immediately conflagrates, right? It becomes a raging inferno around the world and then just move on. They have to bear some responsibility if they want to take essentially all of the profit from that endeavor.
Yeah, I think it's one of those conversations that's just going to continue to evolve too as we have more different types of attacks occurring too, right? It's like, how do we sort of move forward in that? So I want to shift gears a little bit. So I've got a couple more questions for you before we sort of break. But one of them, this is sort of my selfish question because I'm very interested in law terminology and how to use it and how to understand regulations and the laws that actually apply to me as a security practitioner better. So do you have any tips, tricks, resources, any sort of advice for our IT and security practitioners that want to understand law terminology a little bit better?
Yeah, so I try to be effective. I have no idea if I am or not. But one thing that I kind of a trick as a federal prosecutor that we always talked about when you're getting ready to present a case before a jury, which again are lay people. They are engineers, chefs, school teachers, fire marshals, whatever from around the community. He's like, well, if I explain this to my grandmother or my grandfather, will they fully understand what I'm talking about? Right. And so I found, so one of the areas that I do a lot of work in kind of somewhat separately is cryptocurrency and digital assets, blockchain technology. And that is notoriously, incredibly dense topic where people just bring up like bizarre buzzwords and acronyms. And I sometimes get the sense like, I don't know if anyone actually knows what anyone else is saying. They're just kind of like, speaking in Latin or High Gothic or something. But, I had to think through these cases as a prosecutor, like, and you just kind of pare it down. As I mentioned earlier, like, what is like the simplest way to explain this? And so for cryptocurrency, it's like, okay, there's this thing called a ledger. I think of it as like the world's largest Excel spreadsheet. People add to it through this process involving an algorithm. Whoever solves it gets a little bit of money at the end of it. And then once it's on the spreadsheet, it doesn't go away. No one's able to delete it. And that's how we know the trail. Like this, and I don't know how effective that was at speaking to a layperson, but that's at least an attempt at it, right? And the same thing, you want to make sure to make sure the two disciplines speak to each other, you have to make sure a lawyer doesn't go into like, just start spouting off acronyms and statutes like, oh, you have to think about COPPA for kids or whatever. You just say, well, at the end of the day, you're talking about data in motion. When data is in motion, it actually matters for certain laws, like what the data is and who gets to see it. And so when you're creating a security architecture, you have to keep that in mind. It's like a very simple example. And similarly, when someone in the cybersecurity side, which could be equally complex or similarly complex, you could say like, okay, well, when I'm creating this system, what it means the data moves from here to here is that nobody sees it except for X, Y, and Z. And here's the ways they can see it. And that you don't need to get into jargon or anything complex. At the end of the day, we're all people. And that's just try to talk from person to person. And while it's a very simplistic answer, I actually think it would be pretty effective.
Yeah, I like that too. I've done a lot of just in the last couple of years, like terminology, because we talk about like zero trust, we talk about blockchain, we talk about machine learning, but what do those things actually mean? What does that actually mean? So I think that's a really good point. So I'm going to take us to our closing question, which I think it's going to be a good place for us to sort of end on, which is when we're talking about this legislation, we're talking about potentially new regulations or, new things coming out, whether it's from the White House or from Congress, some findings, things like that. When we're talking about ransomware and lots of other cybersecurity challenges that we have just sort of ongoing. If you could give one message to the American people, maybe it's about the legislation, maybe it's about other laws or regulations that might be coming. How do you think that we can address this challenge and what do you think that's going to look like?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally it's a message of hope, is that we absolutely will deal with this problem, but we'll only be able to do it together. So it's a hope and a call to action. I mentioned the conflagrations earlier. I mean, listen, we are a nation that put a man on the moon. You don't think we're going to be capable of stopping some rando Russian from hacking a school? No, we absolutely can. We absolutely will. There's a caveat to that. It will only work if we do it together. If every company, every executive, every individual, every government agency decides, I don't know, it's not my problem. I'm not going to disclose the breach, or I'm not going to be secure by design. It's too expensive. Yeah, then it's going to take a lot longer. And honestly, I'm going to guess, I'm not speaking for Congress, they're going to create way more laws to increase the burden until people get it. But think of it this way. Ukraine, the NotPetya attack a couple of years back, wiped out the entire Ukrainian electrical grid, right? Because at that point, that was the Russians taking on essentially what you drill down to, like a guy at a power grid facility. Now, fast forward to the current tragic Ukrainian war. Before the Russians set foot in Ukrainian territory, again, based on public reporting, they tried to turn off the lights again. What happened? So they went and they said, we're going to go after this guy, this group at this substation. And they went, oh man, these are super, super sophisticated APT groups, right? The best of the best. And cyber offense generally is 1,000,000 times better than cyber defense. That's kind of been the rule for the past 20, 30 years. They went after this one substation. Like, man, you can't turn off the lights. It looks like we're not just dealing with this one guy, this one substation. We're dealing with the entire Ukrainian electrical grid. All these people are working together to keep us out. And they're like, oh no, it's not just them. It's the entire Ukrainian government all working together to make sure we lose. It's not just the Ukrainian government. It's Ukrainian people all coming together. It's not just the Ukrainian people. It's their allies around the world and foreign partners. It's the United States, Ukraine, United Kingdom, allies around the world providing TPPs, insights, help, say, no, this is what's happening. Here's how we can stop them. And not just governments around the world. It was our private actors, incredibly amazing cyber warriors in Microsoft, Mandiant, and others who went in and helped fill the gap and said, we're not deriving a profit here, or deriving some profit, but they probably could have used those hours to do something more. But this is a problem worthy of our time. And they filled the gap with everyone else. And when you stood together for the first time in maybe even human history, cyber defense was superior to cyber offense. And that's how it happens. The first time we do that, obviously it's an active thing. It takes a lot more effort. But once we create a system, pursuant to the cyber strategy, where it's resilient by design, that's just muscle memory. It's not hard to do. It's not resource intensive. That's how we'll get there. Just like conflagrations before, just like how we defeated our adversaries in World War II, just how we landed a man on the moon, we can do it. We absolutely will, but it has to be together.
I think that is a great message to end on. I think the cybersecurity community in general, we all tend to, for the most part, right? We tend to work together. We share information. We try to help each other. It's one of my favorite things about the cybersecurity community in general. So I think that's a great message to end on. So thank you so much, Matt Cronin, for joining us this morning. We covered so many topics and really appreciate your insights into that. So that's going to take us out for this week. Thank you again, and we'll see everybody next Friday.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Matt.